Can we start?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, it's fine.
Okay.
After 5. Yeah.
Well, hello everyone. My name is Lynn Stevens and I'm a founding member of the Women's Climate Congress, known as the WCC. Before we go any further, I'd like to acknowledge that here in Australia, we're meeting on Indigenous land that was never ceded. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, particularly at this time when the referendum on an Indigenous voice to the Australian Parliament is so much on our minds. On behalf of the 6 organisations hosting this event, and we'll put links to them in the chat, it's my pleasure to welcome you all here today, especially those who are joining us from overseas. And I'd particularly like to welcome Dr. Lynn Reader, Jamie Bristow and Professor Christine Wamsler, who'll be our main speakers today. And I encourage you to introduce yourself and where you're coming from in the chat. And most importantly, to add your questions as we go along. Before I hand over to Lynn Reader to set the context and take you through the format of this event, just a couple of words about the WCC. The WCC is a network of women across all political views, and we cannot stay silent while the unfolding climate emergency threatens the future of our children and all life on Earth. We aim to inspire collaboration across all political views to co-create a pathway to climate security and a just and sustainable future. As part of this work, we developed a WCC Charter for Change based on consultation with many hundreds of women across the nation. And it has 11 calls to action. The first 3 are to secure the climate, and the remaining ones are for longer-term human and planetary well-being. Action 6 is elevate kindness and compassion in government, which explains why the WCC is so pleased to be involved in this event today. And this seems exactly the right place to hand over to Lynn Reader from the Charter for Compassion Australia. So over to you, Lynn.
Good. Thanks, Lynn. Yeah, thanks. And on behalf of the Charter for Compassion Australia, I welcome you all to this session. I also take a moment to acknowledge the Indigenous lands wherever they are for you, and by acknowledging elders past, present and emerging, paying respects and acknowledging. So the context for this webinar is that the Charter is working with the Women's Climate Congress on Action 6 of its Charter for Change, as Lynn just referred to. And so Action 6 is specifically to elevate compassion and kindness in government as qualities that can be respected and applied. Mindfulness and compassion are 2 of our inner states and motivations that provide the conscious connections needed to better deal with the crucial challenges facing humanity today, and certainly climate change is one of those. So I'm pleased to be here, that we are here to discuss a very recent report from the Mindfulness Initiative UK entitled Reconnection, Meeting the Climate Crisis Inside Out, with 2 of the authors, Jamie Bristow and Christine Wamsler. So Jamie will give a presentation first, and then Christine and Jamie will be in conversation, and then we'll open it to questions from you, the participants. So if you have any questions as you go along, please type them in the chat, and then Lynn will have them for the Q&A. So let me first introduce Jamie. Jamie Bristow is the co-director of the Mindfulness Initiative UK, and in that role he has authored a series of publications such as the one we are discussing today. Jamie has worked with decision makers around the world to integrate inner capacities and contemplative practice into the public policy landscape. Jamie has a background in psychology, climate change communication, and also is part of the Inner Development Goals. I don't know if people heard of the Inner Development Goals. It's a wonderful initiative that is looking to see how we can accelerate the work towards the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And then Christine. So Christine Wamsler is Professor of Sustainability Science at Lund University's Centre for Sustainability studies in Sweden. She is founder and director of the Contemplative Sustainable Futures Program and is an internationally renowned expert in sustainable development with 25 years of experience, both in theory and practice. Her work has shaped international debates and increased knowledge on personal, institutional, and policy transformation in the context of climate change. She has had many international projects. She has led many international projects and published more than 200 academic papers and book chapters and books on these issues. I don't know how you get the time, Christine. So, and I was very honoured that Christine and I have actually worked on one of those book chapters. So thanks, everyone. And I'm now going to hand over to Jamie, who'll run us through his presentation.
Thank you so much, Lynn, and Lynn for your gracious introductions. So lovely to be with you here, which is my morning, a very dark and rainy morning, so I'm slightly poorly illuminated. But greetings to wherever you are, evening, afternoon, or wherever, and thank you for spending this time on this topic of all the things you could be doing. I'm, appreciative of your attention and interest. So, as Lynn mentioned, I have been the director of the Mindfulness Initiative, which has been a oh dear, oh no, fine. Had a minor PowerPoint hiccup there, but we're good. So I actually stepped down, Lynn, from the Mindfulness Initiative as co-director fairly recently. So I should have gotten you an updated bio. I retain a role there as sort of policy lead for sustainability issues. So I'm sort of working there part-time, as well as this new role for the inner development goals, leading on public narrative and policy development. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a background about where we've come from, how we got to this report, which was produced by the Mindfulness Initiative in partnership with the Lund University Centre for Sustainability Studies, where Christine is professor. So the work on mindfulness and compassion by the Mindfulness Initiative, it's sort of set up to look at both of these core human capacities, but as Lynn mentioned them. It was set up in 2014 to support politicians in the British Parliament who have been learning about mindfulness and how they could apply it in their political and personal lives for a year or so. And it was set up to help them look at the applications more broadly, how these personal benefits could have implications in society. And we had a range of policy hearings and the publication, in these kind of oak-paneled rooms where people were, very unused to closing their eyes and connecting at a level of shared humanity. We've had policy hearings that culminated in the publication of the first public policy report about mindfulness in 2015. And that's available on the Mindfulness Initiative website, along with lots of other publications, briefing papers on health applications in health, workplace, education, criminal justice, and many more, such as policing, etc. And increasingly, since about 2018-19, looking at kind of bigger, more systemic issues where the evidence is compelling, but isn't so specific. It isn't like we know that mindfulness reduces depression by 38% on par with antidepressants. That's quite easy to make recommendations about. But in the case of some of these bigger systemic issues, we have to work with kind of narrative and building frameworks to thread together the evidence base for these important trainings to make the case that they're really important also to meet bigger wicked problems, as they're sometimes called, sort of ambiguous and complex problems. And one that I have long been motivated by, all of this work I've been doing actually in these areas has actually been motivated by the wicked problem of climate change. And so Here, this picture from NASA kind of illustrates often what many people don't appreciate is the thinness of the atmosphere, how precarious it is, and of course, as I'm sure you know, it's rapidly become out of whack. And yeah, so I've been motivated by this since working for a climate change campaign about 15 years or so ago now, and became interested in why I went from working in advertising to working for a climate change campaign in the course of about a year. And it was actually the inner work that I'd been doing which helped the same information land differently. And my time in the climate campaign world made me somewhat disillusioned, but I thought, like, no one's really speaking about this inner dimension. At that time, at least, we were certainly hoping that just giving people more facts would create the action that we needed. The information deficit hypothesis, as it's sometimes been called. But I had already heard the facts. What made them land differently was my meditation practice. So I went from that climate campaign to thinking, right, how do I fill in this missing piece? Or at least actually my theory of change at that point was so simplistic. It was like, everyone just needs to meditate more and the world will be fixed. You know, obviously having worked in this area now for over a decade, it's a lot more complicated than that. But certainly there is a kind of simple message that we can get across. And that's, you know, if Christine and I leave you with one thing, this might already be intuitive to you, but the climate crisis has largely, almost entirely actually, been discussed as an external issue, a physical problem with technical solutions. And our world is set up to treat technical solutions, technical problems as they're called, but this is actually more of an adaptive problem where we are implicated in the problem. The way we look at it, the problem is part of the problem. And actually, you know, our culture, our psychology is wrapped into our technologies, and it ain't that simple. And so we're starting to see that, you know, in the Anthropocene, where humans, you know, are now the greatest shaper of our geology, of our climate, we must think about the whole human climate system. And climate's part of a human system, and human systems aren't really fundamentally, you know, roads and power lines. They are human beings with evolved and malleable cultures, emotions, cognitions, relationships, and mindsets. Like the images and the beliefs and the ways in which we structure our thinking are so sort of primary to this. So important voices in the climate movement and in sustainability sciences, like Christine, have started to sort of been, you know, raising this issue, particularly over the last 5 years, but, you know, going back, you know, further than that, and starting to get some mainstream traction, saying this neglect of the inner human dimension is one of the reasons why we're moving so slowly and sliding backwards in many cases. And we need to not replace it and say this is all about, you know, meditating or the inner dimension, like we're not saying that, but it's been a missing piece of how we think about the problem and how we design our solutions. And so thankfully, like high profile voices include Christiana Figueres, the former executive secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, saying that there are many changes we need to make over the next 10 years. This is her speaking in 2019, I think. And each of us will take different steps along the way, but all of us start from the one place, our mindset. And Christine's definition of a mindset is our beliefs, our worldviews, our intentions, and also sort of values, capacities, skills, qualities of the heart and mind, which, you know, her work and others is pointing to be so fundamental. And yeah, her advocacy, Christine's advocacy, as well as her colleagues in the sustainability sciences that are starting to wake up to this inner dimension, have actually got this into the IPCC reports that were published last year, the kind of final warning reports that we really have to act on now. And some of the quotes from that include phrases like inner transitions towards sustainability. Inner transitions occur within individuals and also in organizations, even larger jurisdictions, altering beliefs and actions. And then specifically mentioning here meditation and yoga and other social practices that encourage lower carbon lifestyles. So yes, I mentioned this work that I'm about to introduce was done in partnership with Lund and Christine. And so she's been doing work with others to show that the evidence base has got to a point where we can oh, hang on, wrong direction, wrong way, man. That we can do rigorous reviews now of the linkages between inner and outer dimensions of sustainability. We can have some confidence, at least in this initial framework to do more work and to start investing. And so there's an integrated model in this paper here for those who are interested, showing how inner capacities relate to mindsets, our relationships with ourselves, others, and the world, and to climate action. Highlighting that amongst all of the evidence, I think, is it something like 30% of papers mention mindfulness or something, Christine? I can't remember exactly. But yeah, there's a potential role of mindfulness and compassion there. So that was the kind of jumping off point for the piece of work that I'm going to introduce now. We wanted to ask the question of both policymakers and experts in the field: when you think about or talk about the inner dimension of the climate crisis, what do you say? How do you think about it? We did 26 in-depth interviews with policymakers and politicians about how they perceive this intersection of mind and climate change. And further, if you do perceive it, how should it be considered in your work in policy making? And then we consulted with over 100 experts working on inner outer change at an academic level or a sort of leadership level. And the outcome was an academic article and a report, and the Reconnection report, Reconnection: Meeting the Climate Crisis Inside Out. So first of all, the academic paper sort of summarized the 4 ways in which we found people talk about this. One will be the least surprising for you, and this is the one we found politicians were most aware of. And that is that the mind is perceived as a victim of the climate crisis. Of course, quite high profile now is the impact on young people particularly. And there is now funding from the Wellcome Trust and interest amongst policymakers in this particularly. Less likely, but amongst some policymakers and most experts, is the awareness that the mind is perhaps ultimately at the root of the climate crisis. How exactly people frame that, I will come on to in a minute. Thirdly, some people saw that the mind is a barrier to climate action. So here we're used to phrases like denial or repression, or cognitive biases, like the confirmation bias or the bystander effect. And one way of understanding actually our lack of action is a massive bystander effect, because it's just such a diffuse set of responsibilities. And finally, those who do really get these first 3 sometimes see that there is a feedback loop between them, and a kind of somewhat scary feedback loop in that some of the impacts of climate on mind make the causes worse and the barriers greater in some cases. And so the increasing polarization, etc., that might come from the fear and the threat response that we're physiologically feeling can lead to greater barriers, for instance. Okay, so here a quote from a leading Green politician in Europe, one of the members of the European Parliament that we interviewed. He says the IPCC conclusions haven't changed in 15 years, basically. They've got worse or more nuanced, but there is climate change, humans are causing it, there's great impacts, we have the policy instruments at a reasonable cost. Why is it not happening? Why is making changes so difficult? In other words, in the words of another colleague, where is the IPCC report with that level of rigor about why we haven't acted on IPCC reports? And we're trying to understand that now, but perhaps, that's the big question. And that question includes the inner dimension, or perhaps primarily the inner dimension, as well as politics and systems and all the stuff we're probably a bit more aware of. So how should we understand this intervention, both the kind of that part of the problem and part of the solution? Well, hang on, let me just remind myself here. Well, from our research, there are actually many different ways. From 100 experts, there are 100 different ways of talking about it. But actually, what we found is that there's a winning narrative coming through now, and that is that the problem is this climate crisis is perhaps primarily a relationship crisis, and that is characterized by disconnection, by separation. And this is, the sense of ourselves, particularly as individuals, separate from each other, disconnected from other parts of the world. We have inherited, at least in modernist thinking, you could say Western thinking, but certainly modernist thinking, also Judean-Christian thought. It goes well back, but has become a kind of like dominant paradigm globally. So it isn't just current Western thinking, if you see what I mean. This is not to say that we aren't connected. Of course, we're deeply interdependent. What's missing is conscious connection, or the understanding of connectedness, and a mistaken perception of separateness. And this leads to social isolation, alienation from nature. It's perhaps part of the polycrisis or meta-crisis, which is also about our political crises, other sorts of sustainability crisis, our crisis of attention and technologies, and all of these regulation of AI, lots of issues are to do with basically a lack of wisdom. And so our failure to acknowledge the wholeness of our world and to feel the harm that we're creating on the other side of it, to care about that, is part of this disconnection. So we're disconnected from others, from nature and from the world, and also from ourselves. And these, as I'll show in my remaining 10 minutes or so, are interconnected. So this is, we talk about sort of harming the planet as if we're not harming ourselves.
Something happened, we cannot hear you.
Sorry? You're talking to me? You can't hear me, Christine? Can anyone else hear me?
Yes.
Okay, all right, good. So yes, we're sort of saving the planet as if that's something else, and it's kind of an optional pastime rather than it being, fundamentally us in one big ecosystem. And the destruction we're causing is sort of literally senseless. It's a sensory rift from the world around us, and like I say, from ourselves. So, for instance, as an example, empathy is an embodied thing. If we're separated from our own bodies, we're actually not feeling the sensory input which tells us how other people are feeling, both nature and human beings. And here's some politicians illustrating that. So this is the Member of Parliament who founded the all-party group on mindfulness, saying we need to approach the climate crisis from a position of consciousness and of conscience as well as science. I think that's where mindfulness and compassion can be absolutely key. They make that connection between mind and body and heart in an evidence-based way. And here a politician, again from the European Parliament from Finland, saying I don't just use mindfulness to manage stress, but to create the connection within this work to something deeper. I think of mindfulness as something that connects me with the web of life on our planet that could reconnect us all. And that's where we kind of find the reconnection narrative. So, what we found in our other policy work is, and this is very common, a good story and some human examples trump often a big stack of evidence. We have a big stack of evidence through Christine's work. It's reviewed in nice ways, but we needed the kind of the narrative that cuts through. So enter the reconnection narrative. And this is reconnection to the world, as she's saying here. But actually, Alvina, the quote that I've got in this report from Alvina actually focuses more on her own trauma history, which I won't go into, but it's a very touching story. And disconnection for the body through trauma, etc., is part of the picture, even collectively. So I don't have long here, and perhaps we could go into this in more detail. And one thing that might be quite fun is, if I'm able to see it, I don't know where it pops up, but if there's a particular part of what I'm about to show you that you think, oh, that's interesting, I'd love to hear more, if you could click like the heart emoji response, if you know where that is on Zoom, and I think I should be able to see those pop up as a kind of number of emojis. And so I'll know to kind of like maybe come back to it or dive into it in more detail. But essentially, our report, Reconnection, Meeting the Climate Crisis Inside Out, is showing how natural human capacities of awareness and heart qualities, compassion, are fundamental to human connection, have been part of our success story as a species over countless millennia, and have been underappreciated and undermined by our technologies, by our cultures, by the way we've been living. So we need to reposition this inner dimension as fundamental, rather than just perhaps the story of the selfish gene and that was so dominant in the 20th century. There's a rebalancing going on that's showing us as a heartful species, and that's as important as our ability to manipulate our environment and compete with each other. So the first chapter goes into how these things have been important throughout all time, and the second chapter looks at where we are now at this point in the 21st century, and how these things are being undermined, particularly now, and why they're particularly important now. So we have, in the first chapter, we have mind, body, heart, and mind, body, and mind, body, heart. And just from the very beginning, showing how interconnected these things are. And I have to move very quickly here, so forgive me, but I'll just gloss it super quickly. So we have, in mind, we have attention regulation, showing how attention assembles our reality for us. It renders our world, binds our other cognitive and emotional faculties together. And if we're not seeing something on the other side of the planet or in our own environment, it's often an attention, an attending problem. And we also have a bandwidth of perception, like we're bringing certain qualities to perception. And we can also talk about the heart as an eye. The eye of the heart actually shapes and colors and shows different things to us. And so we need to both attend to what's important and broaden and sensitize ourselves, and develop an ability to shift perspective and get away from rigidity of mind. In the mind-body section, we look at just the fundamental importance of embodiment and the lack of understanding of us as embodied and emotional cognizers. There's a revolution going on in cognitive science that really positions us as embodied creatures, and particularly showing the role of threat response and how this, how climate is a big, massive threat, and it raises our fear of death and leads to lots of fairly predictable defense mechanisms, and how we work with that threat response, and particularly its relation to trauma, collective trauma, intergenerational trauma, which means that we can be stuck in certain threat responses, is fundamental, I think, to a wiser world, a wiser, weller world. And here comes the kind of the jewel of our evolutionary inheritance, as I mentioned earlier: compassion, emotional intelligence, hugely important for our success and survival so far, and vital for our future survival. We have this skewed view of ourselves, and there's a rebalancing underway. And yes, it's not just about it's not just a nice to have. This is as Tom Rivett-Carnat, a colleague of Christiana Figueres, a sort of senior policy lobbyist and author, says, compassion has an enormously practical application to the world. It is an entry point to action on all types of social and environmental issues. It can be considered a kind of motivational system and not just an affect. Here we are then in the second chapter, and we're looking at this particular historical moment. And where perhaps the mind first goes to in this area is like, how do we just manage the difficulty of this? And yes, that's where we start, in sort of staying with the trouble. First, engaging with the trouble, staying with it in a couple of different ways. Then we look at this understanding of interconnectedness and the felt sense, the embodied knowledge of interconnectedness and nature connection. And then we look at the difficult business of actually acting. Once we've turned towards the difficult, we've understood our deep interdependence, how do we then get through this messy problem of the kind of values action gap, as it's called? How do we go into collective response? Thank you. And the so I'll skip this, but this is just basically saying mindfulness has a role to help us to continue to confront the true scale of the environmental crises we face. Okay, so turning towards the difficult, in brief, mindfulness and compassion help us to have a radically different approach to the one we habitually take. And that is to turn towards the difficult, very common phrase in mindfulness training. And it is, for many, a radical reorientation. And it's a radical reorientation we need to do collectively in most cultures and spaces still. I'll have to just gloss that, I'm afraid. Psychological resilience, yes, managing difficult emotions that might be motivators and helpful. We shouldn't pathologize them, but we do need to develop our resource to work with them successfully and build and broaden our positive psychological equipment, resources for the kind of the perseverance and certain forms of hope. I'm not going to say like blind optimism, but certain forms of hope that will help us get through. I say to people, if you're going to read the paper, like maybe look at the things that are most relevant to your work, but definitely read the holistic worldview and expanded identity section. This is the crux of what we're talking about. It's about a development of who we think we are and who and our place in the world. And this looks at mindfulness and compassion and their upregulation of what we call the holistic, intuitive mode of mind, as opposed to the verbal conceptual mode of mind. And this sort of touches upon the pioneering work of Ian McGilchrist, who is gaining a lot of interest and traction, the kind of neuroscientist and philosopher, showing that we're kind of stuck in a kind of flattened, fragmenting mode of mind that he associates with the left hemisphere. We look at how mindfulness is being shown to, reduce affective polarization. So we can think very differently from each other, but we can actually reduce the amount that we hate or distrust each other, which is getting ramped up by social media. And so mindfulness seems to reduce affective polarization. There are other reasons to believe this will help us to at least resist further fragmentation. And then nature connection, vitally important. It's been shown that those who have high nature connection are twice as likely to display pro-environmental behaviors and attitudes. And so connecting to nature, it's no good if you're Instagramming it. So that you need to be sort of mindful in nature, and nature actually helps with being mindful, regulates those things. So there's a real interesting connection there. And I saw a kind of heart emoji go for the kind of, I think, the intention and action stuff. And so maybe we can unpack this more in questions, but wiser wanting, inner compass, and intentional action is the way we break this down. Wiser wanting is looking at the fact that we actually know what is good for us in terms of like well-being economics versus consumerism, etc. And there are ways in which we can orient to this better. We look at how values awareness, sensitivity to values, and helping values guide action is a huge part of, for instance, acceptance and commitment therapy and mindfulness-informed intervention. And finally, intentional action. This is where a lot of the inner dimension of sustainability science looks, which is how can we join up these gaps between what we know and what we want, which is sort of that wiser wanting bit, and between what we want and what we actually do. And so this is kind of where often a lot of mindfulness stuff starts, interrupting into automatic behavior, living more of the time on purpose and not just being conditioned by prevailing cultures or habit, and actually thinking, what do I really want here? What is the most skillful response, rather than the blind reaction or the habitual reaction that I normally take. This is a policy report, so we do have policy recommendations in the back that I will not go into now in the interest of time. But they're kind of stretch goals, and they're broken down into different sectors depending on your interest. So thank you very much. We will go over to questions now. I think some of these links are going to get put into the chat, but please do, you can reach out via my website at jamiebristow.com, and we'd love to hear your reflections on the report if you have a chance to check it out. We are going to be making shorter versions, and it will have a life beyond the current form, so any feedback will be taken into consideration for future work. Thank you again for your attention.
Thank you so much, Jamie. That's just wonderful. It's very, the depth and, to which you're going is really moving us forward. We've been talking about these issues for a little while now, but to get those solid recommendations really important. So, Christine, coming to you, would you like to add something from a sustainability science perspective, regarding the role of compassion and mindfulness in tackling climate change?
Yeah, thank you, Lynn. Well, I guess in summary, from a sustainability science perspective, it's clear that our dominant approaches to climate change are not sufficient. They have not catalyzed the necessary change. So there is really no doubt about that. And as Jamie explained before, the reason, or one reason for this situation, is that really the vast majority of sustainability scholarship and practice has so far focused on the external world, as described by Jamie before. And that really means that sustainability challenges, not only climate change, but also climate change, are framed as external threats. It's out there. So we want to address something that is out there. It's external. And so we address it with external, primarily technical measures. And this is because the way we define problems automatically determines our responses to these. And that is very important. And that's why what is changing the narrative now, and so this is then very crucial, is the fact that we are increasingly understanding that sustainability crises are, in fact, like Jamie said, a reflection of an inner human crisis. And there are different terminologies for that. We call it a crisis of disconnection, a crisis of separation, a relationship crisis, an existential crisis, a spiritual crisis. So different terms for the same thing. And once we have understood that, and then if we trace the roots of sustainability crisis through this story of separation, then suddenly it becomes very clear why mindfulness and compassion are really key in that, because these are capacities that can foster fundamental aspects of connection. And linking back to something else that Jamie said, also from research, sustainability science research, we know that mindfulness and compassion address all four components of the mind sustainability nexus. You remember the four images that Jamie showed? And that means then for compassion and mindfulness that they can support resilience to climate change, they can support wiser decision-making, they can address the root causes of climate change, and then we can increase individual, collective, and planetary well-being. So the vicious cycle of mind and climate change that Jamie introduced can basically be shifted towards a virtuous cycle of mind and sustainability.
Yes, yeah. I mean, we've been talking about this for very many years, and one of the reasons that we said, that it was difficult for people to engage in climate change was that it was something that was happening in the future, but now it's happening. We can see it happening. So I was just thinking, Jamie was also talking about the notion of interdependence. So something else that's bringing us closer to really dealing with climate change is this notion that, we're not disconnected from the environment. And so I was just wondering about if you could elaborate on some of the possible ways, that we can support people through this change.
Yes, thank you. Again, from a sustainability science perspective, I would say that there are different really complementary measures that are needed to support change across individual, collective, and systems level. So we should not see or address them really in isolation. And measures at the individual and collective level, they involve diverse forms of education or training, formal, informal, direct or indirect, that can help us to tap into our inner capacities and potential to nourish fields of change. So this entails creating learning and working environments that can help us to discover our individual thinking and internalized cultures, cultural messages of separation, superiority, and instrumentalization, and then develop alternative approaches. So this can be in form of leadership courses, exhibitions, festivals, or silent mornings in offices, etc., etc. But then there are also these measures at the system level, and they aim to really systematically mainstream the consideration of inner dimensions of climate change into existing institutional and political systems. So that entails modifying organizations' vision statements, policies, regulations, working structures, and also their tools for project management, resource allocation, communication, monitoring, and evaluation. So just perhaps to bring concrete examples of that, there could be, for instance, the development and use of technology that is then guided by intrinsic universal capacities and values like compassion as opposed to GDP, or to change our communication structures by moving away really from this common meta message which supports feelings of powerlessness and anxiety towards communicating a new theory of change that really supports agency and hope, like Jamie also mentioned, that is really important, and based on a recognition that inner development, collective, and systems change are separated and always co-created. Thank you.
Oh, good. Yeah, I think there's a lot to be done in education and training, and but having the conversations, through, as you said, conscious, connection to these issues, and coming through wisdom, as Jamie was saying, and perhaps we can pick that up in some of the questions that people might have. If you do have questions, please put them in the chat, and then we'll take us through those in a second. So, Christine, also in the report points out that the story of human exceptionalism and dominance over our Earth needs to be reframed, and that we are ourselves part of and not rulers over nature. So what are some of the small steps that each of us can be taking to create that ethical shift, towards connection to the Earth?
Yeah, I want to jump onto this ethical aspect actually first,
Sure.
because that's something really important to highlight. What does this work on inner transformation or work on our inner lives or inner development for sustainability means in ethical terms? And it's really important to highlight that taking more account of human inner dimensions qualities is actually really not about saying that we need to fix or change other people's beliefs, values, and worldviews, because what that would mean is that we would turn people into objects to be changed rather than seeing them as change makers, as agents of change. And so then this would preserve then business as usual, really, through this blaming others, dualistic approaches, fix it and fix others mentality. So that only would actually reinforce these current very unsustainable paradigms that we're living in, that Jamie explained in quite detail. So it's really instead, and that applies to a private person, a professional, if it's a policymaker, it doesn't really matter so much, but it's about creating integrative measures, spaces, and conditions then that can nurture a culture of inner growth, mutual support and engagement from a place of shared intrinsic wellness and interconnection. So it's really a change in paradigms that we can support through very tiny measures and measures at a big scale. And I guess what is also important then to know, because sometimes we might just feel helpless in that, but actually according to research, it only requires around 10% of a group to change to support transformation. So it's not really that that 100% of the population has to jump on the train in a way, but really a change in paradigms starts with a group of people, and that can really be small things and big things. What is important is that these actions are not isolated, that actually small projects, activities are linked to this more systematic changes, so that altogether it can actually move things forward. I hope that answered your question.
No, very good, very good. Thanks, Christine. Jamie, did you want to say something there?
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful framing, Christine. And I wanted to jump in because I think it really speaks to one of the questions that's in the chat. Sorry for sort of jumping around a bit. But the question from Kirsten, is there enough time to address the climate crisis from inside out, is really key. Partly, as Christine said, we don't need everybody, but there are a couple of other ways of thinking about it. We're often familiar with like bell curves, the normal distribution of things across society, and there's bell curves of income and various other things. Experts have actually for quite a while now talked about the bell curve of well-being across society. And actually you haven't got to make everyone who's really languishing, having a really tough time, like really happy, and get them to the other end. If you shift the whole bell curve of well-being just a few points, you sort of double the number of people who are really flourishing and halve the number of people who are really languishing at these kind of extreme ends. And so similarly, we could look at the kind of the bell curve of wisdom and the bell curve of compassion. And it isn't just about individuals doing individual work. There are ways in which our myths, our narratives, our organizational cultures, our art can inculcate awareness, compassion, sensitivity, and wisdom and understanding of interdependence. And so, yes, we need maybe some of those 10% that Christine are talking about, who are the artists or the leaders or the people who go out and speak differently about things. And that helps the whole of society shift in a way, because we are such cultural beings and we learn from each other and pick up each other's vibes. So thanks, Lynn. I just thought that was kind of a relevant thread.
No, very good. Yeah, very good. Lynn, did you want to now take over for the Q&A?
Okay, thank you very much, Lynn. Yeah, that was a great question about whether we've got time for all this, and very nicely answered. Thank you, Jamie and Christine. Moving to something a bit more systemic now, one of the questions is bringing mindfulness to climate solutions will bring us to a path of economic degrowth, which is probably an anathema to many economists and politicians. So how do we get society and politicians to be open to this radical view? So I see you nodding, Jamie. Would you like to start? And then
I was going to say, Christine, do you want to kick off?
Right, okay.
Feel free to bat it back to me, but I just want to give you that.
Yeah, I just remember that in one of the interviews that we have, a politician said to us, we politicians, we are also humans. And sometimes we talk about politicians as somehow outside the system, outside, not being individuals as part of this, what I mentioned before, this interlinkage between individual, collective, and systems change. They are part of the story. And actually, the article that we wrote about the link between the mind and climate change was based on interviews with leaders, many of them politicians in high-level leadership positions. So that also shows then that there is increasing awareness of this topic also within the political field. So what I see is that until now, in a way, we didn't have a language to express that many of us are actually feeling deep inside of them. And with more research and these movements like the inner development goals, we suddenly become language that we can use to express something that many of us intuitively know is wrong in the current system. We provide a language, we provide science that now supports that, and there are networks where people can support each other in this shift. And I feel that all these things are coming together, which really makes that it reaches also these levels that you mentioned. And there are now programs from the UNDP, et cetera, addressing the same thing. So I hope that helps a bit.
Thank you. Jamie, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, wonderful. Thanks, Christine. The Mindfulness Initiative published an essay along with a senior analyst from the Bank of England about sort of what the implications of mindfulness to economics were, and there's an assumption in mainstream economic thinking that we will just satisfy our needs or our wants, and we will maximize our utility using sort of economic language, which is to say that we will find the way to most efficiently satisfy our cravings. But mindfulness and associated wisdom and compassion, etc., things that are associated with intrinsic values rather than extrinsic, money, fame, status, power values, do kind of challenge that that kind of hegemonic thought, because it shows that we can, rather than satisfy our desires, simplify them, like choose to actually change the things that we desire. This is complete heresy that human beings are capable of this. That's how simplistic economic thinking is. So what would a society look like if we simplified our desires more and shifted them, or did some more wiser wanting, as we call it in the Reconnection report? Does this mean degrowth? Does it mean a flatter growth? Let's remember that most of the world still needs to grow in order to be materially secure and healthy. And we need to, and so the Sustainable Development Goals, actually most of them about development, about some form of growth and progress. And so I think there are ways in which, yes, there needs to be a rebalancing, and some of the world needs to grow. And if there was wiser wanting, we might not actually spend less money or earn less money and therefore lead to degrowth. We might spend it on different things that are less materially consumptive. So delinking economics and growth from consumption, and there's a discussion of post-material stuff, as well as, I know if we spent more money on massages and mindfulness teachers, and less on PlayStations and Porsches, it would be a start. So I think it's a really complex area. I'm actually embarking, Christine and I both are embarking on a project with the Club of Rome, who are very famous for creating the Limits to Growth report back in 1972. The first, really punchy group of scientists, experts, former kind of premier, what do you call it? Leaders of state, presidents and stuff. They said that we're going to hit some buffers at some point. This is 50 years ago, and here we are at the buffers. And they've created the Earth for All report, which is 50 years on from limits to growth. What can we say now? And they have a breakthrough scenario and a breakdown scenario. And Christine and I are helping them now to ask, who do we need to be to find ourselves on the breakthrough scenario? And these are largely economists, and they're divided over, what this means in relation to growth. And so I don't think it necessarily means degrowth, but it does mean radical retooling, radical reorientation, no less transformative than degrowth might sound. But yeah, let's not be too simplistic about how money and the fruits of human endeavor are linked to, unsustainable behavior.
Thank you.
I think what Jamie basically is highlighting it, you know, in the history we have been quite often at a point where there was a change in paradigms. The thing is that generally we don't really know beforehand exactly how this new paradigm will look like, but we know that we need to have a shift and we have to create the conditions for that to emerge. And I would say that compassion is a good way to create these conditions.
Thank you, Christine, and thank you, Padma Priya, for that good question on the growth. And in fact, this is a 2-minute question, but I think you've led us into it very nicely, Christine. I think we're entering a new phase of human consciousness in relation to nature, our relationship with nature. So this is, honestly, it's a 2-minute answer.
I actually didn't hear you correctly. Sorry.
Well, I mean, if
Jamie, go ahead.
Go on then.
Jamie.
Sorry, yeah, I messed that up for everybody. I will jump in in the interest of time. So, I think there is good reason to believe that we have a huge readjustment ahead of ourselves. That this is a shift in paradigms. Some of it is about a shift in consciousness, which leaves us in a new place. Some of it's about returning to Indigenous worldviews and other ways of seeing the world, which were more attuned and in line with our contingent nature. There's some great writing and thinking by people like Joanna Macy talking about the great turning. And this is a narrative which I think has some real substance to it. And I think we can believe that that is happening actually quite rapidly since COVID. Our understanding of our interdependency, of our contingency, is leading to some soul searching individually and collectively. I think there are other narratives at play in other parts of the picture, but yes, and even like the UNDP, they founded the Conscious Food Systems Alliance because they want to see a shift in consciousness. So this is happening actually at quite high levels of governance, transnationally, nationally, and so yes, I'd say there are reasons to be somewhat hopeful.
Thank you. Christine, do you want to comment on that, about whether we think we're entering a new...
I didn't hear the question, but now picking up on Jamie's answer also about hope, I just wanted to mention, going back to a previous question, that, you know, the models that we have on the climate change models, they are very, they are a source of not being very hopeful, right? A source of anxiety, depression. But actually these models, they have not included this consideration of the role of the inner in supporting change. So that aspect is not included into these models. So I guess in a way, indirectly, yes, we can also get hope from that, that it's, you know, there is not it's not sufficiently considered yet. And once we have started considering that in our approaches, change can be quick if then we link behavior change, culture change, and systems change by actually addressing the inner aspect at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Michelle, for that terrific question to close off our wonderful session. We do have 1 minute left, and it's left to me to thank Jamie and Christine and Lynn for pulling together this rich discussion. I'm sure we'll all be thinking about it into the next little time, and just letting people know we will send through all of the information, all of the links that were mentioned, and the PowerPoint presentation, so that you have a record, and we have recorded this, so you'll get the recording. But I've found this a very, very useful session, and I really want to express my appreciation for your time. And to everyone who attended, we had 130 people who registered for this. So I imagine a lot of people are going to be listening to the recording in the next few days, and will also grow and be nourished by what we've talked about today. So thank you all very much. Thank you to those who participated and for the questions, and for our wonderful speakers. So thank you. And good evening from Australia, and so long to other parts of the world. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Lynn. Thanks,
Thank you.
Christine. Thanks, Jamie. Thank you.